This is Rate of Rise, brought to you by Keys to the Shop. Today we're talking with Jaroslav Tuček of Doubleshot in the Czech Republic. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another Rate of Rise episode where we have elevated conversations on roasting here at Keys to the Shop. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Roast Magazine, which is one of the longest running and most respected trade journals in all the coffee industry around the world. They bring together the best minds in roasting and science and thought leadership around roasting to help you become an amazing roaster, to understand the science, the business, and craft of roasting. It's not just through their magazine. They also publish books on green coffee, on the value chain, on roasting, of course. And it is just an incredible resource, Roast Magazine. So I would encourage you, go to roastmagazine.com and get subscribed today. It's one of the best things you could do with their audio articles, their yearly Roast Summit, the magazine, the books. You will not be lacking for anything to help you thrive as a coffee roaster. Again, check them out over at Roast Magazine. Always thankful for their sponsorship of Rate of Rise. Today, everyone, we are going to be talking about roasting for espresso and some perspectives on how to roast for espresso with somebody who is very well respected in the coffee industry, has been in the coffee industry for over 20 years, and that is none other than the founder of Doubleshot in Prague in the Czech Republic. Jaroslav was born and raised in the Czech Republic and traveled to get his M.A. in Canadian literature at SFU in Vancouver. First job, actually, in coffee was back in 2002 at a Portola Cafe in Monterey Bay Aquarium in California, followed by working as a barista at SFU and learning a lot from the Piccolo brothers at 49th Parallel. After he came back home to the Czech Republic, he worked for the first specialty coffee in the Czech Republic. For 1 year after this, Jaroslav, along with his girlfriend and current business partner, spent a year in Panama and Boquete, learning coffee on the farm level. Jaroslav had the opportunity to be a part of HIQ Coffee Launch in the U.S., where he worked with Graciano Cruz and Willem Boot on the development project in Chalatenango in El Salvador, and was mostly doing QC work and running around farms, building raised beds and cupping coffees during this year. In 2010, he returned to start Doubleshot, sourcing green coffee from people that they met or worked with in Central America. And over the past 13 years, he's opened 4 coffee shops, a training center, and a bakery in downtown Prague. Wholesale is a major part of their business. They've taken part in many World Barista, Brewers, or Coffee and Good Spirits competitions. Jaroslav is a former certified Q grader, SCAA cupping judge, SCA AST, and nowadays is mostly involved in green buying and QC, together with managing different teams of people in marketing, social media, etc. at Doubleshot. He employs around 90 people and sells coffee all around the world, of course, with a heavy focus still in the EU. Previously, they were roasting on a UG22, but currently they're roasting on an IMF 60 and have seen some really great benefit from that switch. Really, we could go on. Jaroslav has a very storied couple of decades in coffee and has had a lot of opportunity to taste coffee at lots of different styles. We could just go on and on here, but today we are going to be focusing specifically on roasting for espresso and how Jaroslav and the team have taken this task on from 2010 until today. And we're going to talk about just how they approach both pushing espresso forward according to what their desire for flavor profiles are, and also pleasing the palate of people that they serve locally, and kind of figuring out how to create variety in espresso. What goes into roasting espresso that is different from coffee roasting for single origin, drip purposes and pour overs, etc. What does quality control look like between the shops and wholesale partners? How do they keep track of how the coffee is pulling? What constitutes a good espresso, according to Jaroslav, and what he has learned over the years of finally tuning his craft and now producing a few different types of espresso, both single origin and blends. So the other thing that's interesting here is the switch from the UG22 to the IMF 60 and what that's done for their espresso. I think today you're going to find this conversation very interesting. And roasting for espresso is tricky business, of course. And it's one of those things that I'm excited to kind of get some perspective on from Jaroslav. And I imagine beyond this conversation, we might have a few more of these conversations on perspectives on roasting for espresso. I'm excited to kind of kick that off as it maybe turn into a series with Jaroslav. So I hope you enjoy this. Here now is my conversation about roasting for espresso with Jaroslav Tuček. All right, Jaroslav, welcome to Keys to the Shop. How are you?
Thank you. Very well. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's really cool to be able to, get on the call with you and know that we're going to be diving deep into something that I've been curious about for a long time. And I've been asking around, and you came highly recommended as somebody who has cracked the code, so to speak. No roasting pun intended there, but on roasting for espresso. And you are one of the OG specialty coffee folks in the Czech Republic and have been at this for quite a long time. So I feel like it's going to be a rich conversation. So I'm honored to be on the call with you and start us off talking a little bit about that history of your company and where you come from in coffee.
So Doubleshot is around 13 years old. We started with my girlfriend on the farm in Panama, in Boquete, where we used to work for several producers, but mostly Graciano Cruz and Maria Ruiz. Yes, we've been roasting since 2010, trying to roast the best coffees we can source. We are a small company. It's still around, 90 people, including all the coffee shops that we have in Prague, downtown Prague. And now basically we're trying to sell coffee all around the world. So we even have new distribution in North America, which is quite exciting for us. But apart from that, it's still a very small company. We have several relationships, around 15 relationships that we've been trying to buy from for more than now 10 years. So mostly Latin America, a little bit of Africa. So that's in a nutshell.
That's quite a brief summary of 13 years, I suppose. You started a company and now you have the company and you have 90 people.
Yeah, well, we obviously have a few shops in Prague. We have a training center as well. So there are a few more things we do, but still the core of the business is a wholesale roastery, mostly in Czech Republic, a little bit of EU and a little bit of abroad as well.
Mm-hmm. And you yourself obviously have been not only running this company, but involved in coffee more of in a global fashion, especially through competitions and quality assessment and tasting and things like that.
Yeah, obviously, as everyone else, I guess. I started as a barista. That's 2003 in California, in Monterey. My M.A. at Simon Fraser in Vancouver. I also worked as a barista. And afterwards, got back home, decided to stay in the Czech Republic and worked for the first specialty coffee roaster here in Prague. And I mostly learned from from the American coffee culture because the first consultant of that company was Jeremy Raths. It's like a famous figure in the US coffee trade. So I learned a lot from him and then a lot from people in Panama and El Salvador when I work at the farms.
Got it. And you starting this company, having more of a global perspective on coffee, are serving a local market that may not have that kind of an experience with coffee. And so you have to introduce your roasted product with deference to them, but also in a sense that you would have to push them. You don't have to, but you probably did. I mean, you tell me, to understand a higher level of roasted coffee. So maybe talk a little bit about the environment that you found yourself in and the one that you were striving to create for the future.
Absolutely, Chris. You're totally right. So basically, in those days, 2008, let's say, what we were against here was like a really Italian-centered coffee culture, or Viennese as well. Czech Republic is based in Eastern Central. We like to call it Central Europe, but it's in fact Eastern Europe. And after the revolution in '89, there was a huge influx of Italian dealers, Italian companies trying to sell Italian coffee style. So when we started the specialty coffee roastery, we were basically teaching people that coffee doesn't grow in Italy, and also it can taste differently than a burnt rubber, and you don't need like a beautiful thin porcelain with like these, what do you call it, paper rosettas and biscuits to serve good quality coffee. Because in Czech Republic, traditionally, people been like kind of hiding the main product behind all these kind of things, like the ceramics. Then they would all these distributors would be selling to you all kinds of other weird stuff, including biscuits and whatnot. So we really wanted to show all the coffee shop owners that the focus should be the coffee itself, and it was very, very hard in the beginning.
And especially for espresso, it is something with, Italian like culture of espresso. Like we owe a great debt of gratitude toward the Italian culture of espresso and the popularization of the drink itself, et cetera. And then there's just the interpretation of espresso that kind of has evolved globally. And you are part of that crew of people who is trying to evolve what coffee could be, the quality of coffee going into the portafilter, how it translates into milk beverages that people are used to drinking, and also in straight shots of espresso. So I'm specifically interested in, as a roaster who is trying to have a viable business, the balance of trying to push that value while also paying attention to how customers are receiving the coffee, literally receiving the coffee in the cup, in those contexts of with milk and without milk.
Yeah, I mean, still it's in 2023, when you ask people here in Czech Republic, I would say 50% will still tell you that the best coffee is at the first gas station in Italy. It's like this classic saying that, it's still here, even after all those years that we've been trying to kind of show something different. And right now, currently in Czech Republic, you have more than 150 specialty coffee roasters, which is a lot for a country of 10 million people. But the perception of Italian coffee being the pinnacle coffee is still really kind of deeply rooted in the Czech, not only Czech people, I would say. I guess when you go further south or east, it will be the same. But it did change a lot, to the better. So nowadays, when you have a new shop, I wouldn't say restaurant, but new coffee shop, 9 out of 10 will open with specialty coffee, which is, amazing.
Okay, so now you've been at this for a while, 13 years, and you've developed a way of making espresso or roasting for espresso that seems to be working, and working especially for what you want the coffee to be represented as. And I'm curious just how far removed it is from the Italian standard, because in my mind, if I'm not going to go to the idea of maybe bad examples of it, but at its best, you have very rich, deep coffee, fudgy, nutty espresso, right?
True.
And for your taste and for your roastery, how do you judge success of an espresso, a coffee roasted for espresso rather?
I think it's been a constant struggle. I still remember William Davies when he competed, I think it was Atlanta, and he started his presentation saying something like, espresso is complicated. And it's totally true. And I've been roasting or I've been working coffee for more than 13 years, 20 years, and I still find espresso being like so difficult. And when I just look at like how we started in the very beginning, it was horrible. Like we were trying to differentiate so much from the Italian way. They were just like totally roasting like undeveloped coffees, super sour espressos, 1-to-2 ratios that just tasted awful. And we thought that this is the way. And I think it took us quite a long time to figure out that that's not the way, because it didn't make much sense. Our customers didn't really enjoy drinking that kind of coffee. But still, it's still ongoing process. I mean, I taste our espressos in my coffee shops almost every day. I'm rarely satisfied. Like seriously, it happens few times a month when I'm like, wow, this is pretty good. Most of the times, it's just like, it could be better. And we still haven't figured it, but we've been trying to figure it the hard way, from really trying to differentiate from what was here. And at that time, we're trying to kind of, how do you say that? Like, to learn to run before you can walk or something like that. That's,
Mm-hmm.
the coffees were really lightly roasted, but we didn't have the means how to extract those coffees. There were no scales. There was no understanding of water at all. There were no VST baskets or no refractometers. So in the beginning, the people really started kind of hating that wave of specialty coffees because it was undrinkable, basically. Maybe I'm now a little bit too harsh on us, but you know what I mean. And that's changed. What kind of state is it? I would say it's the problem is that the baristas have some kind of taste preference that does not match the preference of our customers. You know what I mean? Like we got accustomed to really, really fruity, acidity driven profiles, but then you get like your normal customer in your coffee shop and they are just not there. So you have to be kind of careful about your espressos not being too progressive, let's say. So that's why we are like offering different options.
Yeah, so you've done that to basically find something for various tastes. And, when you're talking about that pendulum swing of, okay, well, we have this Italian standard, and to be fair, maybe a badly expressed Italian standard that causes people to swing so far the opposite direction that it's, like you said, it's undrinkable. And everybody was doing that in the early 2000s.
Yeah, in the early, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, those poor burrs. I mean, let's think about all the work that these motors had to go through. But the opposite of what you hate isn't necessarily something you'll love, because we probably don't hate the totality of what espresso was, just certain aspects of it.
Yep.
And so it sounds like through options you solved it. Are those options specifically designed to satisfy taste profiles through a spectrum? And how do you express those on your coffee bars?
It's been always the problem of what we can do with our coffees, isn't it? Like to brew them as an espresso in comparison to what our wholesale customers and the final home drinkers can do with the coffees. And it's always trying to find the balance, because it's nice to roast like, super good whatever coffee really lightly, and then you can use your decent and EK in your roastery where you have like totally dialed in water and everything. But then you sell the coffee to your wholesale customer who does not have this kind of technological as well as know-how means, or to a home user who cannot extract this coffee in the same way at all. And that's always the problem that I've been finding over all those years. So either we roast according to our preferences and the way how can we work with that kind of coffee, or we kind of take in account who are we selling the coffee to. And that's a little bit different thing. Yes, we did kind of decide on having different options, one few different espresso blends like every other roaster, some single origin espresso roasts. And it's been also about educating those wholesale customers about using the correct accessories and about teaching them all the stuff about espresso extractions. And there's a big part. We have a good training center, good training system in this. Otherwise, it was always kind of a failure.
So your varied blends, do they show up on the bar at your shop pretty regularly? Or is there one espresso that you use for all of your cafes and recommend to people? And how do you determine what that is?
Initially, we started with like one seasonal blend. So we're trying to use coffees that were in season at that time. After a few years, this blend would be usually like 2-component blend. After a few years, we started using a big industrial freezer. So we freeze all our green. So nowadays it doesn't really make much sense to talk about like seasonality. So we use coffees based on our experience, which, over the years we kind of figure out what coffee works good with another coffee based on origin, based on variety or processing. So that would be like our major espresso blend, which is, color kind of spectrum, be around like 60 on a color track. So not quite light, but like reasonably light, but quite developed. I would say developed espresso blend that can be easily used in different settings. And for the more adventurous, either wholesale customers or consumers, we have like a single origin espresso roast of various coffees, which could be funky coffees or various washed coffees, whatever.
Okay.
And then there is one more type of consumer, and that's the one that uses super automatic machines, which are quite popular in our country. So we have a little bit darker roast, I would say old school conservative espresso.
There's a couple of things. There's sourcing and then there's roasting. When you mention the machines and you mentioned the espresso roast, what is it that you're doing differently for espresso that's not just dogma, but practical? Because everyone's like, oh, this is espresso. And they're like, well, can I use this for espresso? You can use anything for espresso, but,
Absolutely.
but you're optimizing certain things for espresso. And what does that mean for how you roast the coffee and why this difference?
We tried like all the coffees that we've been sourcing to brew as an espresso and just kind of took the ones that we enjoy the most, and we start, since we buy from the same producers every year, we are kind of buying and using the same coffees that work the best for us brewed as espresso. So error trying all those years in our major espresso blend, we would be using same coffees year after year. Sometimes we switch one component for the other when there's a problem with the volume for the particular year, but it doesn't change that much because it's just, this works well together. Obviously you can talk about measuring the solubility of those coffees in the blend, how they extract together, and you do all that stuff, but at the end it's about how you prefer the final kind of flavor of the blend. I still prefer roasting single origin coffees because the blends are always difficult, very difficult to figure out. And I totally understand roasters who just do single origin coffees and don't go into blends. But from the volume perspective, we need to blend those coffees.
So when you're blending, is it post-roast blending? Is it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you're optimizing these coffees and they're able to be used in other contexts beyond the blend. Also, if they're roasted for espresso, or are the ones you roast for espresso only now able to be used for espresso?
Yes, we buy specifically those coffees to be used in that particular blend. So when we cap at origin, I know exactly how much I need, how much coffee I need, what I'm looking flavor-wise, and I just know which coffees I'm gonna buy for this espresso blend. Yeah.
Okay, so give me the flavor spectrum that you're looking for. So if I said, look, you're going to have to make me a new espresso blend and use the framework that you use for taste, what is that framework?
It's funny when you ask now, because we just changed our machine, our roasting machine a few months ago. And this question is quite difficult now to answer because we've been using all those 12 years on a classical Probat, on a UG22. So it would be all about the texture, the body, the sweetness. We were quite famous, for very, very sweet and thick, syrupy espressos. Now we swapped to IMF, basically an air roaster. And those kind of flavors totally changed, even in the espresso. So it's just more clarity, more transparency in those flavors, like more defined acidity, fruitiness, and less of that body, of that thickness, of the weight. And some people noticed, most of them didn't. Surprised if our wholesale clients will kind of find out, but they mostly didn't. But it definitely changed the whole perception of that flavor of our espresso, of let's say our espresso blend.
Is that a detriment or is that something you wanted?
It's something we wanted and we're scared of, especially when talking about espresso. I was like super excited to do this for our filter coffees, but I was a little bit scared that roasting on this new roaster will affect the sweetness and the depth of our espressos. I mean, the clarity is just like unbelievable, and the consistency of roasting for espresso is something very important as well, because you roast many batches per day, and that's just like uncomparable.
Do you find that it's a trade-off that you can't get away from, where you increase body, that syrupiness, and you decrease that definition, the articulation of the flavor?
Yeah, but it's always like when you were trying to roast lighter on the Probat, it was very difficult to develop those coffees properly for espresso. So that's what we struggled with on the new air roaster, on the IMF. The development is just so much easier that you have wider options to play with the coffee. So you can do, more things without really struggling with the development.
Okay. And so now that you've switched over, I mean, you're probably going to be continuing to dial in that process and chasing some fine tuning on the espresso. Where are you at this point in that process?
It's funny because on the new roaster, it's just like so easy to roast light. But when you need to roast like this kind of more conservative dark roasts, it's much more difficult. So we are really kind of focusing now on our dark roast blends, even like on our office blend, like dialing in these kind of coffees that before was so easy to roast is much more difficult than roasting a nice Kenyan or whatever, a nice geisha from Panama. So that's very different from the old classic drum roaster.
Interesting. Okay. So rather than just saying, this is our new opinion of coffee, you can maintain that there are some flavors that you will continue to pursue that you may not have achieved at the pinnacle quite yet, rather than saying, okay, well, we have a new roaster now. This is our new standard, and we're just going to call it what it is.
When I tasted the very first, maybe the second batch, I mean, it tasted much better than what I tasted before for those 13 years. So I was like, this gives you so many new opportunities to really kind of keep looking for that pinnacle, that it's just different league. I would say it's a different sport.
Cool. So when it comes to quality control, now that we're talking a lot about that, as a roaster, you have your wholesale customers, you've got your cafe, and then you've got yourself. And I suppose you are also kind of bringing a lot of global knowledge to the table when it comes to quality control. What does a system for quality control look like as it relates to making sure your espresso is consistent, getting feedback from the appropriate places? How do you arrange that so that you're always on top of it?
So obviously it starts in the roastery with the curves. We use Crupster. We measure all the colors. We cup all the batches the next day. We use color sorter for all the coffees. And after cupping those coffees, those ones that are meant to be used as an espresso, we brew on our descent. And then basically we have like a simple spreadsheets for the coffee shops where they log every day the dial in, and then like during the day they do one more log for all the espressos. So they basically write down the recipes, they write down some of their like notes, how it tastes, give them some score, and then just measure the extractions. So I can have a look at how the coffee extracts in different environments, because all the coffee shops have different water sources and different filtration. So there's different water sources in Prague. So I can compare it to our roastery kind of water and see how it compares, how it extracts. And obviously the worst part is the wholesale clients. So it's very difficult to get any feedback from them. So basically we just visit them and try the coffee there randomly. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not that good. Depends. But yeah, I mean, the quality control is mostly done in our shops, and the feedback we get from our baristas in comparison to what we brew in the roastery and what we cup in the roastery.
Have you ever gotten feedback from the baristas in those dial-in logs? Because I know quite a few people that use dial-in logs. Sometimes they just get accumulated, and it's nice that we're filling them out, but we're not actually using them. Have you ever said,
true. That's what the baristas say.
Yeah, like, well, because we did this, has it ever happened where you've been like, yeah, I'm going to change something about this espresso? We've gone through and found a problem that now is able to be fixed because of that system.
I know what you mean, but for me, when let's say my sales guy goes to a wholesale client and he doesn't like the espresso there, he gives me the date of roast, the batch number, and I can check with the logs in the coffee shops how that particular roast, because they normally have it the same coffee, how it tasted in the coffee shops versus our cuppings in the roasters. So it's good to have those logs, but obviously you always have to push the baristas to fill them and to really focus on it, because they're lazy and they usually forget doing it after a few months. But I do like those logs to read their kind of notes and the descriptors they find in the coffee shop. So I think there is good use for that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so then it does get factored into some of the decisions made on how coffee is roasted.
The problem is, yes, the problem is that it's like, 3 weeks after the coffee was roasted. So, because we normally use the coffee, let's say 3 to 4 weeks after roast in the coffee shops. That's our kind of preference. So you find out that you messed up something 3 weeks ago, and that's all obviously, gone. Sometimes even the components of the coffee, of the espresso blend are different. So that's a bit problem. This kind of problem, tasting espresso very fresh in the roastery, we try to kind of go around that by grinding the coffee and leaving it sit for, let's say, 1 hour the next day after roast to kind of get rid of that super fresh flavors from roasting. That helps a little bit. But again, that's the biggest struggle with espresso. It needs to rest, but when it rests, then all the coffee is gone and sold.
And then how the coffee is perceived in milk also, I suppose, is one big question mark, because a lot of roasteries will taste the espresso and love the espresso, and then how it translates to milk sometimes is not as good. How do you determine different quality standards for your espresso and how you roast the coffee based on how it plays with milk?
To be frank with you, we never really focus on that too much. I know what you mean, and it makes total sense when your coffee shop sells 70% milk-based drinks to focus on how it tastes in milk. Never really focus on this aspect, like trying different roast profiles for our milk that we use, because we will always kind of satisfied in the milk drinks.
And the customers are fans of your milk drinks also.
Yes, they are, and it's usually a matter of finding a good milk here rather than really tweaking that roast profile. It's the milk, I would say, is much more important, can influence the flavor so much more than the coffee. And finding good milk in Czech Republic hasn't been really easy, but yeah, we settled on something that works for us, and the customers are happy. To be frank, I'm not a big cappuccino drinker, so I always have to force myself to try it with milk. And I hate barista competitions for that, because you have to try all those milk beverages when you practice with our baristas. It's a good point. And we're not Australia, like where everything is milk-based, right? But still, I would say it's like 60-70% milk versus straight shots. Yeah, that's about that.
It opens up an incredible, and almost you couldn't control it, the variations of types of milks and milk, quote unquote, products like plant-based beverages, and different people want their mocha to taste a certain way. So you not only have various kinds of liquids to add to espresso, but you also have the flavorings. And
we don't really do that, yeah. We don't do any flavorings, but we do use alternative milks, obviously, because the trend came to our part of the world as well a few years ago. So that's quite big nowadays. And the new thing here is the competition milks. So we have the frozen, or the freeze distilled drink on the menu as well, because it's actually a friend who brought it from China and started producing it here in Czech Republic. So we have an access to a commercially made freeze distilled drink, which is pretty cool.
Oh, interesting. Next up is the cryo desiccated milk, right?
Absolutely.
Which really sounds hardcore when you put it on the menu like that.
It does. It does. It does.
But espresso, as it is, being a connoisseur of the pure form of the beverage, obviously, if it's working well, you can track the ebb and flow of the quality a lot easier in its pure form than in milk. Though, as I imagine, the baristas will often, or maybe not so often, hopefully more often, will be drinking milk-based beverages and may have something to say about an espresso blend that, or even a single origin espresso especially. That's something else that I'm curious about. When customers select single origin espressos on a bar, how that feedback translates to how that coffee is roasted specifically for espresso, because some of them just don't play well.
Work.
Yeah, but they're great as single shots. And so they say, well, it tastes great here, but it's like having a Brillo pad in my mouth when milk touches it.
Mm-hmm. You're very right, yeah. And this is something the baristas, that's their job basically, to really explain to the customer that this is an amazing geisha roasted for espresso, but just don't mix it with milk. Just use our standard espresso in the first grinder for cappuccino. Yeah, I don't really kind of have any word in that. It's up to them.
Well, when it comes to roasting for espresso specifically, you mentioned earlier the development of coffee in the roaster is one of the hallmarks of roasting for espresso, and that's the solubility aspect, I suppose. Tell me a little bit more about some of the most important aspects of how your roasting differs for espresso and the levers that you pull in the roasting process to make sure that it performs well in an espresso context.
It's almost impossible to generalize for all the coffees that we roast for espresso. I would say it's just really specific per coffee. What is the weight loss for this particular coffee that we need to achieve in order to develop it enough that we can easily brew it as espresso? And it varies coffee from coffee. When I just, before we started recording, I look at like our different coffees that we now currently roast for espresso. And let's say the weight loss was there was a huge difference actually in between those coffees, and they were all, let's say, washed centrals. And I was surprised because I thought that it would be very similar because the profiles we tend to have quite similar. Obviously, they are a little bit longer than for our filter coffees, and there are some similarities, but we're just generalizing, using more power here, using less power there. But the development for us, it's almost impossible to measure correctly because in the air roaster, it's hard to judge the first crack. So we don't really focus on the development ratios, same way that we did with the ProBat. So now we focus more on the weight loss when it comes to the development of those coffees. If it makes sense.
And why is that important for espresso?
And also I didn't mention the color, which may be one of the most important factors. So let's say our espresso roasts are all in a certain color range on the color track. So let's say 60, 61, 62, whereas our filter coffees would fall much lower and would be like 52 to 56.
Do you think that's a universal thing for espresso?
That's a matter of preference, obviously. If you take Tim and Bo's espresso roasted coffee and compare it to ours, it will be like our filter roast. So I would say it's totally dependent on how you extract that coffee, because if you take that super light roasted coffee from Norway and you brew it, in most environments in Czech Republic, you will just not extract enough that it's sweet, rounded, balanced espresso, because it's just like so lightly roasted. So for us, we really need to kind of consider where and who is brewing those kind of coffees and be kind of, I would say, conservative, yes. Yeah, definitely. A little bit more conservative, because you will just never have the same environment as you have in the roastery. So I would love to use, lightly roasted geishas for espresso, but I know that I really can't, because most of my customers will never extract it well.
It would almost be like now we have the tools to do what back in the day we tried to do, but now, it's a matter of serving the customer.
Yeah, I will give an example. We just participated in the World of Coffee in Athens, and I was like trying to figure out which coffee to bring there and present as our, espresso. And initially I wanted to take one of our standard espresso coffees, but I was like, hey, it will be us brewing the coffee. We'll have our dialed in water, we'll have our espresso machine, our grind, everything will be set up properly. So why not go a little bit crazy and just try to, brew the best possible espresso, because I can afford it now. But the very same coffee would rarely or hardly sell to anyone from my wholesale customers, because I'm pretty sure they would have troubles achieving the same beverage.
And in the end, in terms of what is success when it's related to how espresso is expressed in a beverage, is pretty subjective, right? So your customers want something that performs well. You, on the other hand, you and I and lots of people listening, we're just weird people, right?
Yeah.
We're these coffee people that with our going crazy phrases, I want these crazy coffees. I imagine there's this sense of, you're hard to satisfy, you want to push the envelope, but then you have to console yourself with the fact that you're also serving people who have a quote unquote lower standard.
Sorry, I will give an example, and that's the ratio, right? I love let's say 1-to-3 ratio on lightly roasted espresso coffees. I love it. But yeah, you just cannot really tell your customers who are used to 1.1 to 2 espressos, hey guys, start brewing this as an espresso in your coffee shop, because first of all, they will not have the fitting porcelain. It will never fit into their demitasse cups, right?
Yes.
So they will, have you gone crazy? We cannot do that. But my preference would be for these larger ratios. I just enjoy it so much better. I don't like the very concentrated, thick David Schomer ristrettos. I just cannot drink it, you know?
Oh man, I have a soft spot in my heart for these coffees. I do.
I'm kidding. I mean, when I have it once, in a few years, I like it as well.
I understand where you're coming from. And it's also the benefit we have of being in community is there's a balancing factor where no one of us can go very far, especially as connected as we are now, without meeting some helpful resistance to what would otherwise be a runaway train of our subjective preference, forced upon the masses. It kind of brings me to this idea of influence on taste making and how competitions, you mentioned World of Coffee, and the idea that espresso technology is so, competitions are such a catalyst for this, and yet they're so far removed from the average coffee experience. What does it look like to buy and roast for those competitions? And what are your thoughts about how it impacts people's perception of espresso in a larger community?
I hate doing it. Always the time of the year when you have to choose and roast for the competition is difficult. I mean, we have many baristas who want to compete, and that's great. But all of them want some super nice, expensive coffee, which is impossible to do because you have a 60-kilo roaster, and roasting 20-kilo geisha costs something, right? So that's one of the difficult things to do. But the competitions are just about filling the right fields in the form, in the cupping form, or in the evaluation form, right? So basically, if you want to succeed, you just go point by point and you choose the coffee that will score the most, even though you might not like it yourself. But you want your people to advance, to the world stage or wherever. So after all those years of experience competing, like we've competed so many times, we've been so many times to WBC, the Brewers Cup, whatever, that now we know that you really have to just follow those categories and just choose according to the sheets, to the score sheets. And yeah, then you choose the coffee, and basically you have 1 or 2 chances to roast it well on the big roaster. For the Worlds now this year, we decided to use the small sample roast, the rest, because I was just hesitant to really take my chances with 1 or 2 batches. Even though for the Czech nationals, we did roast coffee on the big roaster and we succeeded. So it's possible, but kind of nerve-wracking when you throw that expensive coffee into the big machine. But yeah, you were totally right. Totally detached, doesn't make any sense basically to a standard customer. But very necessary to kind of motivate your people and move them forward, because otherwise, they are stuck in the coffee shop doing the same thing every day. And the competition is just an amazing platform to really push them further, learn more, experience something different, get out of their comfort zone, get excited about coffee, right? That's why we do it. And yeah.
Let me play devil's advocate here a little bit and say that there's an opposite side of this, which is, maybe I'm off base on this, but I've heard it spoken many times by baristas. Like if you ever gone to like a day camp or a camp experience and you come back and then you're like, oh, I wish my whole life was like camp. And there's this down after the high, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, I'm back to the same old machine, the same old accessible espresso. It's not this geisha, or it's not this crazy process. And so people start feeling a lack of motivation because they look at the competition as this pinnacle and the daily as the drudgery. And I'm curious about what it does take to continually engage people who are representing something that is a good espresso. You put a lot of work into the things that you serve on your bar. even though they're not quote unquote competition espresso, so to speak, to keep them motivated after the experience of competition, or even just the fact that they're watching competitions? What does that do? How do you do that?
Very difficult, very difficult. And what happened to us a few times is that, let's say we send some baristas to do a coffee exchange in the origin. And I thought it would motivate them, but they would come back and they would leave the job because they thought, this was, amazing to be in Antigua for 1 month, and I don't want to, work anymore in this coffee shop. There is just the same old stereotype, and they would leave coffee at all. It happened to us more than 3 or 4 times. So I know where you're heading, and you're very right. It is difficult. It depends on the personality, I would say, a lot. Obviously, our biggest challenge is that the employees cannot really advance that much further, right? Yeah, you are a barista, you can be a shop manager, you can be a barista trainer, but what else? What else is there for you if you want to keep them in the same company? So, yeah, we try to give them the means to kind of get out of the stereotype, either by competing or by traveling to different farms, different origins, if they are interested. Most of the young people are not. They don't want to get out of their comfort zone. They want to stay in the same coffee shop for the whole year and basically stay in the same part of the city. So not everyone is like super keen on running around Huila in Colombia and visiting producers. But I'm thinking about this all the time, like how to really motivate your people who work their asses off every day in the coffee shop, serving the same coffee, serving the same customers, and doing it 24/7 basically.
There's something beautiful about stability and about consistency. And even today, in the climate we're talking about, related to the climate or related to the equity in coffee, there is a lot of talk about buying from the same people over and over again. A lot of talk about how blends are coming way back into fashion today, more so today than they were maybe 10, 15 years ago. And there's a stability that it's easier to celebrate. And I feel like espresso itself must be at the center of this. And I'm hopeful, based on what you're saying, that even though you are serving the same customers and maybe using the same espresso, exploring the depth of those things, it creates a lot more character in you as a professional. And you as an operator, of course, you get to know this coffee so well. You're going to be able to better handle new coffees as you get them because of that depth of knowledge.
Absolutely. That's the idea. And I also learned that, not the hard way, but in the beginning, when we started our first coffee shop, we would be changing everything every month because I thought that you need to offer your customers the variety and they will get bored by drinking the same wine. So we would change everything every month. The whole wine selection in every month was different. All the coffees would be different. And then after all those years, like doing this, I was like, maybe it doesn't make any sense. Maybe the customer, when she tries a nice wine or coffee, they would like to try the same one again when they come again to your shop. I kind of stopped experimenting with this and settled down a little bit and slow down as well. And you are absolutely right. The consistency, same offering, it's not a bad thing. And when it comes to coffee, that's basically the core of our business. We have 15, maybe 16 producers that we work with every single year, same people, basically the same coffees. I wouldn't say it's hurting our business. I really prefer doing it this way, and our customers are super happy when they see a coffee on the shelf that they know. So, yes.
And it's part of what the cafe value proposition is that comfort and a part of someone's life that they can count on. Making espresso specific to this conversation is a part of that consistency, and having it taste the same, similar, and good every day, such a huge task. And so as we wrap up here, I'm just curious what your advice would be to somebody listening who really wants to dial in their process of roasting coffee specifically for espresso and do it to the utmost. In your experience, what are the key things to do that well?
I guess, not get disappointed during that journey, right? If you are not pulling the god shot every day, nothing really happens. It's it's good at least you try and you don't just kind of give up on that. I would say that's like my kind of way to really the perfect shot all the time and get better and better, even though I know that maybe in the next 15, 20 years, I might never really succeed in that. And that's a nice thing. I kind of enjoy the journey. So yeah, I mean, consistency and trying to really focus on the different things, not the specific things of the brewing, right? Not to change, like you when you're trying to create good recipe, don't run around changing various aspects of brewing the espresso. So stick with your technology, stick with your water, and maybe just play a little bit with the ratios. Then it becomes difficult when you use machines like the Decent, when there is a tons of different profiles and it can get so overwhelming. Let's say find one thing, focus on it, and then play with it, but not try to change everything, because then you just get overwhelmed. But it's such a complicated beverage.
I imagine the same thing would go for how you would approach dialing in your roasting process, whether you're using air or a drum.
Totally, yeah, absolutely. It's always, I tell my roasters, just change one thing in the roast profile, try it again, let's cup it. Sometimes I tell them, hey, we're not changing anything after we try the coffee several times. It's not like after one cupping we're changing the roast profile.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So just make sure, like, it's not going to be just a whim. It's going to be well researched, and you'll make an adjustment based on pulling that shot of espresso a few times, different ages or resting times and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I'm really thankful for you being on the show and talking to us about how you approach espresso roasting. It is really illuminating.
Of course, we'll meet here in 10 years and
yeah.
let's see where we got.
Yeah, we have to, in 10 years, you should come back on the show and we'll take the conversation again. Thank you very much. Where can we learn more about Doubleshot and all you do?
Obviously, you can visit our website, which is in English as well, doubleshot.cz. And yeah, I mean, you can try us even in States. Now maybe in Fragment, Minnesota. That's a coffee shop that currently has our coffee. There is Suited on Manhattan, and I think 8 Ounce in Canada is selling our coffee as well. So if you are in North America, definitely try our coffee there. And in Europe, that's much easier.
Yeah. Any cafes in Italy?
Actually, yes. There is a beautiful shop in Bologna owned by the Brewers Cup champion Alessandro, and they serve our coffee quite often. And
yeah, he was
I
on the
love
show
those
also.
people.
Yeah.
Really? Okay, amazing guy.
Jaroslav, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And one of the great takeaways from this, I think, is not being afraid to evolve your approach to coffee. I mean, a switch from the traditional kind of drum roaster to a modern air roaster is, maybe rife with trepidation. There's what's going to happen. Will people notice? According to Jaroslav, it is not something that people notice too much, but they are happier with their coffee. And there is something to be said for you as an operator sticking to what you do best. My friend Andy Newbaum over at Torque Coffee Roasters, who we've had on the show prior, kind of famously had this refrain that I've heard many times, which is, don't give people what they want, give them what you do best. And I think that there is some wisdom in that. And here is someone who I think is trying to chase like a standard for espresso in the coffees offered, while at the same time, obviously, wanting people to enjoy it. But naturally, I think the balance there is you attract people to your brand of coffee who enjoy the coffee that you put out. And roasting for espresso is obviously something you have to do, bearing in mind the context, the way that people are going to be brewing it most often. If you've got 4 cafes, like Jaroslav does at Doubleshot, you have to pay attention to how it's performing across the different beverages that you are putting out there. So staying connected with how it's performing out there in the wild and letting that kind of dictate how things go in the roaster, I think that's wonderful. So a huge thank you to Jaroslav Tuček of Doubleshot in Prague. If you are interested in learning more about Doubleshot, the best thing for you to do is go to the website doubleshot.cz. CZ for the Czech Republic, and they have an English language podcast as well as Czech. So definitely go visit, especially if you're in Prague or any of the places that carry Doubleshot, maybe in a multi-roaster cafe near you. So thanks again, Jaroslav. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about today's episode, if you have some thoughts about roasting for espresso, thoughts about what Jaroslav has talked about here on the show, go ahead and email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. You can reach out there if you're interested in some coaching or consulting through Keys to the Shop Consulting as well, chris@keystotheshop.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Roast Magazine. Go to roastmagazine.com to do that. Get plugged into the universe of resource that Roast has developed over these years. There's a reason that they are the #1 resource for education in roasting, in my opinion. But go there and find out for yourself. roastmagazine.com. And with that, that is the end of the show. Everyone, thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe to Keys to the Shop for more of this kind of content. And I thank you again. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.